Slendytubbies. I was never really that big of a fan growing up watching these types of fan games, despite me watching YouTubers such as DLive and Markiplier play it when I was younger. It was a Slenderman fan game after all, and well, Slendytubbies became a whole series that spanned 3 different games. And well, the obvious reason why it got so popular in the first place, as it created its own fandom, was because if you were growing up around the early 2000s, edgy mascot horror games reached a peak, such as Slenderman the 8 Pages and Jeff the Killer. Something that isn't scary that was intended to be for the sake of it, trying to be horror, was done many times. Coincidentally, the game Slendytubbies also made numerous creators make fan games to expand on the Slendytubbies franchise. And to be honest, they were mostly mediocre at best. There was effort put into these games, don't get me wrong, but it lacked a certain tone and atmospheric mood that made these games so not scary. Most of the Slendytubby models in these fan games lacked any horror features at the very least that could have made a Slendytubby an actual threatening character to look at and be bewildered. Yet to my surprise, there is a game that not only improved the entirety of what Slendytubbies could have been, but exceeded my expectations on how to create a horror game. This is where we enter Slendytubbies 0. This is Slendytubbies 0, a fan-made reincarnation of the original Slendytubbies from 13 years ago by Host Game Studios. This is where we enter as Ron, a guardian of the Teletubbies who is looking for another Teletubby named White to confront due to the machine being broken. White is feeding from what we can presume is Lala, Dipsy, Poe, and Tinky Winky as their children. This also adds on as White has failed to report on the events that occurred when watching the 4 Teletubbies that the organization Coat has assigned White to do. We will go back to Coat in a bit. This is actually a callback to Slendytubbies 3 when we were watching over the 4 Teletubbies at the very beginning of the game. Now, surprisingly, Ron isn't a new character in this franchise, and was actually a minor character from Slendytubbies 3, and Ron being a main protagonist in the story is actually quite interesting to say at the very least, since there was very little info known about him in the actual Slendytubby franchise. As we move on from the situation, we go explore the mainland and find 5 pages to collect to get the key to open the door to White, since he's locked himself ever since the incident that had happened. Now, the incident that the game is referring to is similar to how the Teletubbies were first infected in the original series, which was from an infected custard done by Nunu. Yet in this version, we see in time how White, who was their caretaker, dealt with the Teletubbies when they had consumed the custard, as there was no more food left to eat. As we get all 5 pages to access the drawer for the basement key, we head down towards the basement, but get ambushed by Tinky Winky. The traps that are set are really important in this story, as this is one of the ways to stall Tinky Winky. As we retrieve our key back from Tinky Winky, we now go towards the basement. Once we enter, this is where our camera actually is important to continue on the story, as there are many of these dark creatures in the building that are known as the Watchdogs. For us to continue, you need to be on the lookout looking for the custards throughout the building for the spare parts to fix the electrical box to turn on the power. Once you get the spare parts needed to continue on the story, this is where a new gimmick comes in, which further adds onto the upcoming events leading into the finale of what is to come next. Once we return to the hideout and fix the electrical box from the spare part to turn on the main power, we get captured by Tinky Winky, who is morbidly disfigured, and we soon are forced to consume the infected custard. We soon wake up into an unknown area where a new mechanic of having to move when the eyes looking at you, and as the further we move along to our destination, the music rises as it builds tension because so far, Each objective in the game has been very simple, as doing a task, finding pages and parts was never really that difficult so far. It's simple yet it works, since this is a remake of the very first game of the Slendytubbies franchise. Now, this really does hold you to your seat, since we really don't know what is going to happen to us next. After we make it to the exit, we are back in our office, and this is where we enter the OG gameplay of Slendytubbies. Collecting the 8 custard, it is pretty straightforward, as this is all we have to do, is just to collect all 8 custards. There are small mechanics such as finding rabbits to give to Lala, or an extra dodge mechanic in the game when we encounter Tinky Winky. Lala is really important, especially because if you are very low and you have a rabbit with you, she will be able to heal you, which will able to at least enhance the experience and make sure you don't die. After getting all the custards, we enter a small part of the game of running around, following these lights as we avoid a shadow-like Teletubby following us around. Not much can be said besides one of the shadow-like creatures following us around, but once we collect all the light sources, we get a shiny-like figure, which is a axe, and this leads to a very new mechanic which is present, as this is what we assume is a foreshadowed event of what happened to the Guardian. It never tells us specifically if this was before, but this is what we can safely say it is, since we can see the Guardian who was alive at the time and we last saw him dead. Aside from that, we enter Tinky Winky's perspective. Your main objective for this is to kill the Guardian before he collects all 5 custards for you and all of the other Teletubbies, and I can safely guess why this is because the Guardian had to scourge around to find more food, which was his mistake. Once you kill the Guardian, we enter another cutscene of us actually killing Tinky Winky. We see how the infection is now spreading to us since we were forced to consume the infected custard. Nothing for us to do, we lunge at Tinky Winky's dead corpse. That was Slendytubbies 0, but it isn't over yet. The post-credits show us 2 agents from the Code Foundation coming upon the island and discovering Ron. It was already too late. We witness Ron feeding on Tinky Winky's dead corpse, and then the camera shuts off. The end of Slendytubbies 0 is harrowing, yet knowing the sealed fate between Tinky Winky and Ron will haunt those who are willing to give this game a shot. That was Slendytubbies 0. Now, this game doesn't break any world-changing views or editing styles that new modern horror games can take into consideration at the very least. It is simple, yet it intensifies as you progress into the story, since the very first Slendytubbies was, to be honest, a kind of pretty bad horror game that got turned into something that actually works in some ways. Despite how many times my computer has struggled somewhat running the game, I ran into a few issues with it, such as the game crashing on certain occasions, which made me have to start all over since the game only saves from the last section of the game you are currently on. The soundtrack and atmosphere really fits in well from a psychological point of view, and can be nostalgic to an extent for people who are revisiting Slendytubbies today. Despite being made in 2012, the original obviously had some odd jump scares, or even though there were some small jump scares in the current Slendytubbies 0 game, there weren't something that you jumped out of your chair for. That's how a jump scare should work in this context. It is supposed to startle you into being aware of the situation you are dealing with as well, since you aren't intended to play this game to be flinged out of your chair, but on the edge of your seat, as the atmosphere really carries on that aspect, as the soundtrack is hazed in the mainland of where the Teletubbies were set off onto. This game wants you to feel uneasy. It wants you to feel paranoid. It lets you know you are not alone, venturing out there to save the Teletubbies. If we really look into modern Slendytubby horror games, it follows the same routine of the original game of Tinky Winky and its disfigured face, while this game takes on a new aspect of Tinky Winky, a more realistic approach of what it means to be a psychotic killer. If there's one thing that this game took a modern approach on, is the use of vintage horror or analog horror, for example. There are a lot of moments where the use of analog horror is played during many cutscenes. One of those, for example, is when you die. There are multiple parts of you that play in an analog horror aspect showing your demise. Another great one is when you attack the Guardian when playing as Tinky Winky. There is a reason why I believe this works so well with the reimagination of Slendytubbies as well. This game didn't want to be like every other Slendytubby fan game of reusing the same assets of the original Slendytubby game. It took an approach from a modern point of view that used the ideas of analog horror and mood to really mesh in and create one of the best Slendytubbies fan game there might have ever been. Slendytubbies Zero reimagination never made me really think about how stupid the concept of it really is once you play it. Throughout the game, when you really progress into the story, it really does have you hooked on to what is going to happen next, despite these being Slendytubbies to an extent, and it sort of just works. This game really defies on what a Slendytubby fan game could be, or even the actual product itself, whether it's a revamp or a remaster of the original Slendytubbies game. You would never really think or consider about how a single fan-made Slendytubby horror game can really define on how to create a type of fan game of this community. Yet, like I've said, it works from both a horror standpoint and a psychological standpoint at the very least. Now, Slendytubbies Zero isn't the best psychological horror games by any means necessary, but this doesn't make it a terrible game to play itself, since it leans more into a reincarnation into a 13-year-old game that had basically no storytelling. But from what the community of Slendytubbies has, this definitely has to be one of, if not the best it has ever put out so far, as there are many reincarnations of the Slendytubbies franchise that were either complicated or were scrapped altogether, never to be finished or worked on again. This game had a long hiatus of being in development since 2021 during the rise of analog horror, as its main inspiration of making the audience intensified, and it really does show how much effort and time it can really take to pull off such an incredible piece of media. You see, despite my weird relationship with the franchise, I think it does take a lot of jump scares and uneasy moments for someone to really settle in and see how much potential any sort of horror game can really have, whether it's a form of entertainment or to scare the living shit out of you. The game Slendytubbies Zero is really something to look into, since despite its minor flaws, there are a lot of aspects in the game that anyone can look forward to when it comes to psychological horror in general, whether its analog horror aspect or its unsettling atmosphere that takes place on Tubbyland. Nonetheless, Slendytubbies Zero is definitely something that is not only great, but can really change on how these type of fan games can be interpreted, as there is so much potential for these upcoming horror games to take inspire of, without the need of draining the original predecessor. You never really need to consider how silly the concept such as Slendytubbies can really be something as great as this, since there are more copies from the Slenderman franchise that follow this concept that took a massive rehaul, with Granny being an example. Slendytubbies Zero follows these steps, and there are upcoming exciting stories waiting to be remastered to fully bring on that genuine horror experience.